So, hello everybody, and welcome to today's webinar on Imbalance Settlement. I'm David Thomas. I work in the market analysis team within ELEXON. Today's session is an introduction to Imbalance Settlement, so I'll try to cover all the main topics, but of course if there's any more information you need afterwards, please don't hesitate to contact us. So, what am I planning to talk to you about today? Well, I'll start off with the core principles of imbalance settlement. Then I'll move on to talking about contracts and how parties trade with one another. I'll then talk about how we collect data from the metering and how that's allocated to various parties. I'll then move on to national grid and the actions that they take to balance the electricity system. I'll then talk about how settlement happens for both volume and the price that's used for that settlement. And then I'll finish by just a quick overview of BMRS and where you can find further information. So, core principles of imbalance settlement. Now, one question we're always asked is, what is the difference between National Grid and ELEXON? So, National Grid oversee the grid code, whereas ELEXON oversee the balancing and settlement code, or the BSC. So National Grid deal with the physical balancing on the system, so making sure that generation and demand are balanced on the network. At ELEXON, we deal with imbalance settlement, so any differences between what parties say they're going to generate and what they've contracted for, and what they've metered volumes are, will be an imbalance, and therefore we will work out the charges for those and either pay or be paid by parties accordingly. So how does National Grid help balance the system? Well, we have something called the transmission network, or sometimes called the network or the grid, and these are large cables that run up and down the country, allowing power to be transferred across the UK. Best way to think about this is as though they're the motorways of the electricity world. Attached to the transmission network, we have a number of large generators and a number of large suppliers. We also have 4 interconnectors that allow us to trade and export and import power from other countries in Europe. So we have 1 that goes to France, 1 to the Netherlands, and 2 that cross the Irish Sea, 1 to Northern Ireland and 1 to Ireland. Now we move down from the transmission network to the distribution network. So these are 14 regions of the country that have smaller cables, so like the A and B roads across the UK, that allow power to be transported to your homes, for example. So connected at the distribution network level is smaller scale supply and smaller scale consumption. You can see there are 14 regions across the country, so there are 14 GSPs. These align with the old historical distribution network operators that were in place when the market was segregated back at NETA. Since then, we've obviously had some merging of those DNOs, and now we currently have 6 DNOs that work across the country. Now, to make it easier, rather than having to remember the names of each of the regions, each one has been assigned a character, a letter. So, for example, Scotland, North Scotland is _P, whereas London will be _C. These are important as they enable us to see from a party level what area of the country some particular volume or contracts relate to. Okay, so another important concept to understand when talking about settlement are settlement periods. Now, electricity in the UK is settled in settlement periods, each of which last 30 minutes. Therefore, they are sometimes known as half-hour or half-hourly settlement. Therefore, there are usually 48 settlement periods in a day. The exception to this is the clock change dates, where we lose or gain an additional 2 periods, with the hour being lost or gained. So here's an example of generation across a day period, kind of second by second, minute by minute. We at ELEXON are not interested in exactly when during a half-hour period energy is consumed or produced. We're looking at the volume across the half hour. So there's an example. We have a volume half hour by half hour across the 48 periods of a day. So just to run through the concept of imbalance and help you to understand the different parties that are involved. So again, a summary there: ELEXON accounts and settles mismatches between BSC's contracted and metered positions. So prior to the settlement period, parties will notify contract volumes to ELEXON. The settlement period will then take place. National Grid, if they need to, will take balancing action through the balancing mechanism to adjust for that particular period. We then collect the metered volumes and they're sent through to us at ELEXON. We look at the difference between the metered and contracted volumes, and that's the parties imbalance. But note, we also need to take into account any balancing actions that National Grid have taken. And lastly, then we have an imbalance volume, which will be multiplied by the imbalance price, and that's what will be settled with the BSC parties. Okay, so moving on to contracts and trading. So as mentioned earlier, we capture the contracted volumes from generators and suppliers, so we can see what they've bought or sold to try to balance against their position. So parties can notify ELEXON of contracts anytime up to the start of the settlement period. Now, this was a recent change that came in November last year. Prior to that, parties had to notify contract volumes at what was called gate closure, which was 1 hour before the start of the settlement period. But since modification went through in November last year, they now have an additional hour in which they can notify us of any contracted volumes. So they've got up to the start of what's called the submission deadline, at the start of the settlement period. Gate closure is still used when providing information to National Grid on your plans for generating, but I'll talk about that a little more later. So how do parties trade? Well, majority of energy volume is traded through a bilateral contract. As the name suggests, that's a contract between two parties, a generator and a supplier. And once the contract's been agreed by both parties, it'll be submitted to ELEXON by a number of different ways. So either through a dedicated high-grade communications line, a low-grade web connection, or through an ECVAR web service. ECVAR is Energy Contract Volume Aggregation Agent. So these are people who collect all the contracts together and will send them through on parties' behalf. I'll talk about them a little bit later in the presentation. So here we have an example of a bilateral contract between trading party 1 and 2. So they've agreed to do a trade for a particular period or periods for a particular volume at a particular price. Those details will then be passed through to what we call an Energy Contract Volume Notification Agent, or ECVAR. Now, their job is to pass that information on to ELEXON systems. However, they do not need to pass through any details on the price. It's simply the periods that are covered, who the parties are, and the volumes. Now, the ECVNR can be one of the trading parties, or it can be a separate third party who sends through that information to us. That information will be encrypted and then will be decrypted when it's received by our systems. So another way of trading is through a power exchange. Now, currently in the UK, we have two main power exchanges. We have what's called the Nord Pool Spot Market and EPEX Spot. They both work in the same way. So you'll have two trading parties, both of which will look to put information on the power exchange about what power they have to sell or buy. Once a trade's been made, the information for that will be taken by the power exchange and then passed through to ELEXON systems once again. As before, that detail will be encrypted and then decrypted when it gets through to our systems. The main difference here between this and the bilateral contract we spoke of earlier is that in some cases, the trading parties do not know who each other is. They will simply be trading with someone else via an exchange. Okay, so you've agreed these contracts between you and other parties. So how can you make sure that that information has gone through and been correctly received by ELEXON? So you'll receive two contract reports. A forward contract report, which is the ECVA IO22 report. And again, as the name suggests, this gives you a forward view of your contract position for 7 days out from the day the report is provided. You receive that 4 times a day, I believe in the morning, early afternoon, late afternoon and evening. In addition, after the settlement day is finished, you will receive an end of day report, the ECVA IO14, usually around 2 AM in the morning. And this summarizes the energy contract volumes, so the ECVNRs, and the metered volume reallocations, the MVRNs, for the last settlement day. Now, I'll talk about MVRNs a little more in a later slide. And it provides period and cumulative indebtedness data, as well as telling you of any parties that are in credit default. So a very important report, one to keep an eye out for, if only to make sure that your volumes have come through okay and that you're not in credit default, because that can obviously lead to problems. Okay, so moving on. So we've had our contracts accepted, settlement period has been and gone, and now we need to collect the metered data. So, quick summary, how do we do this? We collect the data from 3 main groups. So from generators, who've obviously produced the power, from suppliers for their customers and the consumption of power they've had, and from the grid supply points we spoke about earlier. All of those are taken together and worked, and we use those to work out the imbalance settlement. Now, just to explain what balancing mechanism units, or BMUs, are. So these are the granularity in which ELEXON receive data. They have certain characters at the beginning of their BMU IDs to make it easier for us and other parties to recognize what sort of BMUs they are. So if a meter point and a BMU begins with a T, that's a site that's connected to the transmission system. So tends to be large generators. Then if it begins with an E, those are sites that are embedded into the distribution system. So embedded generation or smaller scale supply. And lastly, we have anything starting with an I is for the interconnectors that we spoke of earlier, the 4 interconnectors. So for the demand, it's got a D in there, so IBD, and for generation, it's got IBG in the name. So you've got a pair for interconnectors. So that's the kind of generation side. On the supplier side, every supplier will receive 14 BM units as default, 1 for each GSP group. Now, these are characterized by beginning with the number 2. The fourth character of the BMU ID will have a letter, and that corresponds to the relevant GSP. So for example, down the bottom of this slide, we have 2__C. So that's any customers that you supply as a supplier in the London region. Again, I said obviously that we only receive information at BMU level. So whether you have 10 customers or 100,000 customers in one particular GSP group, we will only see the aggregated data of all those meter points that you have. So just to summarize again, here's our metered energy volumes, and you can see that we've, for the generators, you've got 2 BMUs, one starting with a T and an E, so one transmission connected and one embedded in the distribution network. We have our suppliers, a couple of example BMU IDs there, so for regions A and B, and obviously we're getting metered volume at each grid supply point. Okay, so what does that mean for a BSC party? So each BSC party will have 2 accounts, a production account and a consumption account. And as the name suggested, any generation or anything that begins with an E or a T for the BMU ID will go into the production account, and any consumption, so any customers you supply, depending on their GSP region, will go in the consumption account. Now, this is important. I'll come on to a little bit more later, but you need to remember that we receive data at a BMU level. We therefore look at your production and consumption accounts in total for that aggregation, but we will only invoice you once. So as a BSC party, you will not receive a separate production and consumption account invoice. You will just see the net position for the BSC party. Another thing to talk about is short and long terminology, because I might be using that later in the presentation. So both the party and the system can be described as short or long. So for a party, if a party is short, it has a deficit in the electricity volume. So it would need to pay for that volume at the imbalance price. So as an example, for a generator, this will mean the volume generated is less than the volume sold. The opposite of that is a party that's long, so has a surplus of electricity volume, and therefore they'd be paid for their imbalance volume at the imbalance price. So an example of this could be a supplier whose customers have consumed less than the volume they bought for those customers. Now, for the system, if the system is short, it means there's a deficit of energy on the system. So more is being consumed than is being generated. And when that happens, National Grid needs to take actions to try to increase the level of electricity on the system. They do this by accepting things called offers. If the system is long, it means there's a surplus of generation on the system. And therefore, National Grid needs to take actions to decrease the level of electricity on the system, and they do this through something called bids. I'll talk more about bids and offers later on. So here's an example of a BSC party. So on the production side, they've contracted to sell 100 megawatt hours for a particular period. Their power stations have only generated 90 megawatt hours, and therefore their imbalance volumes for the production side are minus 10 megawatt hours. So they're 10 megawatt hours short. However, on their consumption account, they've contracted to buy 200 megawatt hours. Their total customer consumption was only 180 megawatt hours, and therefore they have an imbalance volume, a surplus of 20 megawatt hours. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we only settle at BSC party level, so their net imbalance will be plus 10 megawatt hours. So that will be their imbalance volume. Now, I mentioned earlier about something called a MVRN. That's a meter volume reallocation notification. Quite a mouthful, which is why we tend to call it a MVRN. So here's an example. We have a BSC party with a production account and a consumption account, and some example BMUs feeding into those. We also have BSC party 2, who only appear to be a generator, are only using their production account. So they've got some embedded generation, and rather than deal with the system themselves, they pass that over through a MVRN to another party. So in this example, they've moved it over to party 1. So a MVRN can move a fixed volume or a percentage of that volume. So you can either do it in megawatt hours or as a percentage to one or more parties. So in this example, party 2 could have MVRN'd with party 3 and party 4. The vast majority, in fact, I can't think of anyone who doesn't. MVRNs are based on the percentage of the volume. That way, if your volume changes, you don't need to put a new MVRN in place. It's simply a percentage of that. The other thing to note is that you always need to move from a production account to a production account and from a consumption account to a consumption account with your MVRN. Okay, so we've spoken about contracts and about metered volume. Now I'm going to move on to the electricity balancing mechanism. So what is this? This is what National Grid do to balance the system. So in order to do that, they need to know how much supply there's going to be at what time and what demand there's going to be at what time. They then provide us with data on those balancing actions, and we take that into account when doing the imbalance settlement volume. So how do they do this? Well, they have a demand forecast, which tells them roughly how much energy they think is going to be needed half hour by half hour across the day. And then they compare this with the generation that's planned to be dispatched at the same time for the same periods. So how do generators let National Grid know what their plans are for generating? They send through what's called physical notifications. So there's the initial physical notification, or IPN, and that's sent through a day ahead by 11 o'clock, and that gives them a view of what the particular generating party thinks they're going to be producing throughout the day for each BMU. They then feed through a final physical notification, or an FPN. That will give updated information if anything's changed on each settlement period for each BMU, and that needs to be submitted by gate closure, which, as I said earlier, is an hour before the settlement period takes place. Okay, so I also mentioned about bids and offers. So bids and offers are a BSC party's willingness to operate their BMU unit differently to their FPN. So their willingness to either increase energy to the system or remove energy from the system. Increasing energy in the system is called an offer. So that will be either increasing their generation or decreasing their demand. And removing energy from the system is a bid, and that will mean decreasing generation or increasing demand. They will submit their bid and offer pairs along with their FPNs or PNs. And National Grid can then choose which of those to take and obviously adjust the system accordingly. So here's an example of a gas-fired power station. So they have their FPN set at 100 megawatts across the day. They've contracted to that volume. So they've sold all their expected output. They've also submitted some bids and offers saying that they'd be willing to increase or decrease their FPN based on certain prices. So in this example, they'd be happy to increase to 125 megawatts if they were paid £30 per megawatt hour for the additional volume, or up to 150 megawatts for an additional £50 for the megawatt hour. Note, they will only get paid £50 for the additional 25 megawatts between 125 and 150. And likewise, they've agreed to bid down or reduce their generation at £15 and £35 respectively, for reducing to 75 and 50 megawatts. So if we assume that National Grid have called them and asked them to increase their generation, so they have had an offer accepted, they've asked them to move up to 140 megawatt hours. So this particular party will receive £30 for the first 25 megawatts of that period, and then £50 for the additional 15 megawatts for that period, for however long the offer has been called for. So it could be minutes, could be hours. In this example, once they've been asked to come back down to the FPN, they will return bound to that and remain at the 100 megawatt hour level. Okay, so later on that day, this particular generator has had a bid accepted. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this example is for a gas-fired power station. So they've agreed to pay National Grid to reduce their consumption. In this example, minus £15. The reason they've done that is because they can sell the gas they would have used to generate and make more than £15 from the gas. So in this example, National Grid have asked them to reduce down to 75 megawatt hours for a period, and the party is paying National Grid £15 per megawatt hour for that bid. Okay, so we've spoken a little bit about contracts and metered volumes, and then what National Grid do. And we know all those come together to make the imbalance volume. We've also spoken about how that's applied to an imbalance price. Now, there will separate presentations that go into detail on the imbalance price, but the important thing to realize or remember is that we have a single imbalance price, irrespective of whether you are short or long, whether you have a deficit or surplus of imbalance generation, volume, I should say. So single imbalance price is calculated by National Grid, and they use accepted bids and offers for each settlement period. That then goes through a process which has 14 steps. Some of the bids and offers will be removed. Some will be repriced, and you'll end up with a volume and a price that will be your single imbalance price for that particular settlement period. Now, you may have seen that from the 1st of November, there's been a further change to how the imbalance price is calculated. We now use a par of 1, and we have a dynamic LOLP and a vol of 6,000. That obviously means that the more marginal bids and offers are likely now to set the price, because it's only going to be the most expensive 1 megawatt hour of bids and offers that will be used to set the price after all these steps have taken place. So we've calculated our imbalance price for a given half hour. We've worked out our imbalance volumes by taking contracted volumes, the metered volumes, and any balancing actions taken by National Grid. We multiply then the imbalance volume by the imbalance price, and that is your imbalance charge for a BSC party for a particular settlement period. So a quick resume of what we've spoken about. So ELEXON capture contracted volumes from generators and suppliers, so we can see what they've bought and sold. The settlement period then takes place. We then capture the metered data to understand what was actually consumed or generated during that settlement period. We then gather data from National Grid on any balancing actions that they've taken in each settlement period. And we calculate the imbalance volume. as the difference between the contracted and metered volumes once National Grid's balancing actions have been taken into account. We then multiply the imbalance volume by the imbalance price, and depending whether that's a positive or negative value, we'll either make payments or receive payments from BSC parties. So another quick summary of what we spoke about earlier. So important thing to take from this is that metered energy, so the metered volumes we see are on a BMU level. So for suppliers, especially suppliers, GSP, BMUs, that'll be aggregated data from each of their meter points. Energy contracts we receive will be notified at either the production or the consumption account level. But an invoice for settlement is only sent to the BSC party level. You will only receive one invoice per BSC party. So we then move on to what's called a settlement run and how we reconcile all this data. So if you think about the non-half hourly market, we're not going to have metered data for each half hour. A lot of it will be estimated data based on profiling. So on the particular settlement day occurs, and then 5 days after that, 5 working days I should say, we get a snapshot of all the available data we have for that particular day. A further 18 working days, and we will get what's called the first settlement, or the initial settlement run, and that will have a slightly better picture of the metered volume for that particular day. We then receive further reconciliations until we receive the final reconciliation 290 working days, or around 14 months after the settlement day took place. By this time, we should have accurate data that's been collected for all our half-hourly and non-half-hourly metered customers. So how do we then settle, or how do you settle as a BSC party against that? So as I mentioned, 5 working days after the settlement day, there'll be an interim information run, or an II run, and that will give you an idea of your position. We then have the initial settlement run, or SF run, 18 working days. Reconciliation run 1, 2, 3, and then the final reconciliation run 290 working days, or around 14 months after the settlement period started. The important thing to remember here is that the interim information run is for information only. We do not bill against that. It is only from the SF run that your invoices will be billable. We've also got on there a DF run. So if there is a dispute raised on any of the settlement information, then you can run a disputed reconciliation run, which is up to another, I think, 290 or so working days after the final reconciliation run. So when you receive your invoice of trading charges, what does the information on it mean? So the main 2 elements that you'll need to worry about are the energy imbalance cash flow. And as the name suggests, this is the imbalance volume multiplied by the imbalance price, and that gives you your cash flow. You will also see BM unit cash flow. Now, this will relate to any bids and offers you've had accepted by National Grid, and therefore either the money you've agreed to pay or be paid by National Grid for moving away from your FPN. You also have something called residual cash flow reallocation cash flow, which is sometimes called RCRC, or otherwise known as the beer fund. Basically, for each settlement period, the actions that National Grid have taken won't net each other off exactly. There will be some residual cash flow left over. That is therefore reallocated out to all the parties based on their volume in that particular half-hour period. And lastly, you may see what's called a BM unit non-delivery charge. And this is for any accepted bids or offers that you have failed to deliver. So you'll be charged for those. So if you want to find out more information, a really useful place to look is on what we call BMRS or BM reports. Now, this holds close to real-time data on system prices or imbalance prices, the imbalance in the market, so whether the market is short or long, gives you a view of system demand, both forecast and actual, as well as lots of other information on there. It will also let you drill down into how the system price has been calculated for a particular half hour. And you can see, what plant has been called or bids and offers for a particular half hour as well. So if you haven't looked on there, I'd suggest visiting that website. Lots of useful information. And secondly, if you want further information, please go along to the ELEXON website. If you look under operations and settlements, there's a number of pages there that you can read through, some of which will summarize what I've told you in this presentation, but it'll also take you through and hopefully answer some more questions you might have. Okay, then that's the end of the webinar from me. So if you have any questions or wish to contact us, you can do so. There's my email address there, david.thomas@elexon.co.uk. And that's the end of the webinar. Thank you.